Notebook of Doom. Chomp of the Meat-Eating Vegetables. Chapter 1. Rack Attack! Are you ready for a surprise? Asked Alexander's dad, putting on an apron. Alexander watched his dad chop a stalk of celery. That depends, said Alexander. Does it involve vegetables? Sort of, said his dad. You've been saying how strange the food is at school, so I decided could start making your lunches at home. Alexander thought about the weird meal they served at Stermont Elementary. Alexander smiled. Thanks, Dad. Now, why don't you clear off the breakfast table while I finish up here, said his dad. As Alexander was putting the milk away, he noticed a flyer stuck to the refrigerator door. Chow down at the Stermont Elementary. Where? Your new school. Still under construction. Why? To raise money so we can finish the job. When? Friday night. Kids are the waiters. They serve the adults. Hey, neat, said Alexander. This chilly supper sounds. He paused. Something suddenly felt wrong. He looked around the kitchen. The coat rack. He thought. It definitely wasn't here yesterday. It seemed to loom over his father. Some people may see a new coat rack and think nothing of it. But not Alexander Bopp. After moving to Stermont, he had learned two things. 1. His new town was full of monsters. 2. Everyday items like coat racks could turn out to be monsters. Alexander tiptoed up to the coat rack. Coats and hats? A perfect disguise, thought Alexander. But wait! Just to be sure, I'll look in the notebook. Alexander pulled an old notebook out of his backpack. He had found it on his first day in Stermont. It was filled with monster drawings. He flipped it open. Stick figure. Super skinny monster that disguises itself as a flagpole, fishing rod, walking stick, etc. Habitat, rooms with high ceilings. Diet, beef jerky and banana taffy, twisted into a long rope. Peck, stick figures, peck. Hate woodpeckers. Behavior, these guys love to limbo. Warning! Stick figures can't stand water. A single drop scares them away. All right, kiddo. Time to dash. Alexander's dad turned to see his son leap from the counter, screaming a battle cry and snapping a wet dish towel at the coat rack. Alexander landed upside down in a pile of coats. The rack was still standing. Ah, said Alexander's dad. You noticed our new coat rack. He helped Alexander to his feet. I got it yesterday when I went shopping, for this. He handed Alexander a brand new lunch box, fully packed. Thanks, Dad, said Alexander. His dad winked. You bet. Now, get to school, he said. I'll pick up these coats. Chapter 2, A Snack for Stella. Alexander hopped down his front steps. A girl in a hoodie waved to him from the sidewalk. Hey there, Salamander, she called. Salamander was Alexander's nickname. His teacher had called him that on his first day of school, and it stuck. Hi, Nikki, said Alexander. He walked over to her, swinging his new lunch box. Nikki leaned in. Any SSMP news to report? She whispered. SSMP stood for Super Secret Monster Patrol. The SSMP was a group of kids sworn to protect Stermont from monsters. Alexander and Nikki were two of the group's 3 members. Nope, Alexander said. I thought there was a monster in my kitchen, but it was just a coat rack. Nikki nodded. Well, you never know when a big, ugly creature could show up. Hey, weenies, barked a voice. Wait up! A spiky-haired kid ran through somebody's flower bed to catch up with Alexander and Nikki. It was Rip Bonkowski, the third member of the SSMP. Guys, said Rip. Look what happened! He held up a broken skateboard. All four wheels had been mashed flat. Did you throw it off a building? Asked Nikki. Huh? No, said Rip. Something super heavy must have mashed it into the sidewalk. But I'd only stopped for a second to feed her. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Feed who, Rip? Rip pulled a radish from his pocket. It was covered with nibble marks. Stermont Stella, he mumbled. The gopher? Asked Alexander. The one who dove into her hole to hide when those shadow smashers came to Stermont? Yeah, said Rip. His cheeks turned redder than the radish. Those shadow smashers really scared her. I've been stopping by Durwood Park every morning to bring her a snack. She needed a friend, said Nikki. She grinned. The sun sparkled on her braces. Rip, did you actually do something nice for someone? What? No. Stella's just a gopher. Rip threw his radish at Nikki. And anyway, what about my smushed skateboard? Who would do something so mean? Maybe someone who doesn't like gophers, said Alexander, laughing. Now, let's get to school. Chapter 3, Cool School. Every time I come to this school, said Alexander, I feel like I'm about to have my temperature taken. Yeah, said Rip. It's creepy that our school used to be a hospital. Don't be such babies, said Nikki. Anyway, the new school is almost ready. That's why Principal Vanderpants is having the big chili supper, so dash. Bonk! Nikki crashed into the sliding doors. They hadn't slid open like usual. Look! The doors are frozen, said Alexander. Rip grunted as he yanked on the doors, forcing them apart. A big gust of freezing air blasted his face. Alexander, Rip, and Nikki could each see their breath as they walked into the lobby. The walls were white with frost. Grab a coat, shouted a tall man in a parka. He was handing out clothes from the lost and found. Mr. Horsley, said Alexander. Why is it so cold in here? Mr. Horsley was the school secretary, gym coach, bus driver, and nurse. He was also a former member of the SSMP, although he never wanted to talk about it. I'm not sure, said Mr. Horsley. He gave Alexander a sweater and ski goggles. Alexander noticed icicles on the ceiling. He said. This winter wonderland feels like the work of a monster. He pulled out the notebook. Maybe some ice mice, or a chill billy, or even a snomby. Eep, yelped Mr. Horsley, trembling. Put that notebook away. Mr. Horsley handed Nikki a puffy jacket. I don't think this coldness is monster-related, said Nikki, pointing. Look! The air conditioner must be broken. An odd-looking man carrying a toolbox was heading toward the elevator. He wore a dark ski mask and overalls that read Stermont AC Repair. Brrrr, said Rip. Pass me a coat already. Oh, said Mr. Horsley. There's only one left. He tossed Rip a furry black and white snowsuit. I'm not wearing this. Rip shouted. Ripley Bonkowski, said an icy voice. The room grew even colder as an unsmiling woman drifted around the corner. Hi, Principal Vanderpants, said Rip. The air conditioning may be stuck on full blast, she said, but I will not have my students catch cold. You will dress warmly. Rip looked at Alexander. Alexander shrugged. Nicky snorted. Oak away, Rip said, slouching. He pulled on the snowsuit and zipped it up. Perfect, said the principal. You are now the fuzziest, wuzziest panda at Stermont Elementary. Off to class, you three. Rip started to growl, but it only made him look cuter. Chapter 4, Cry, Cry Again. Alexander wasn't sure he'd ever get used to having class in a Morgan underground room where the hospital would stick dead people. But after several weeks of fighting monsters, a cold, windowless room was no big deal. Alexander swung open the heavy door. At least Mr. Plunkett likes to joke around, he said to Rip and Nicky. Imagine how gloomy our classroom would dash. Wah wah! His teacher sat on his desk, crying into his hands. Boohoo, cried Mr. Plunkett. Take a seat, Alexander. Alexander adjusted his goggles. Every student in the classroom was sobbing, including Rip and Nicky. Are you guys okay? Asked Alexander. He sniffed the air. And, hey, what's that smell? Just sit down, weenie, Rip said between sobs. He stumbled to his seat. Alexander followed Nicky to their table. She wept like a baby. Why are they all crying? He thought. There must be a monster behind this. He opened the notebook to a page speckled with old tear stains. Blubber ducky. Squeak! The blubber duckies. Song makes kids cry. Rub-a-dub run for your life. Behavior, blubber duckies float alongside regular bath-o toys, waiting to be squeezed. Habitat, hot, steamy baths. Diet muddy kids. Warning! Don't squeeze M unless you're ready to become duck chow. To survive, never take a bath. Alexander closed the notebook. Well, blubber duckies aren't making us cry. He said to Nicky. They only hang out in hot baths. It's so cold in here that even my ski goggles fogging up. Alexander gasped. My goggles! He pulled them off. Instantly, his eyes began to sting. Tears rolled down his cheeks. He snapped the goggles back into place. Honk! Mr. Plunkett blew his nose. Since you will be serving the grown-ups at the chili supper this Friday, we will spend the rest of the week studying table manners. You'll all learn how to be polite little waiters. The class cried even louder. That sharp smell, thought Alexander, rubbing his nose. It's so familiar. Nicky, I know that smell, he whispered. It's onions. Chapter 5, Just Dessert. Yes, lunchtime. Alexander called back to Rip and Nicky. He dashed out of the elevator and into the freezing cafeteria. Rip dabbed his eyes with his panda mitten. What's the rush, salamander? There'll just be something yucky on the menu. I came prepared, said Alexander, jiggling his lunch box. Good thinking, added Nicky. They stepped up to the menu. Ooh. Sorry, guys, said Alexander. Hope you can choke down your riri fried beans while I'm eating a delicious, homemade lunch. The kitchen door swung open. A tall chef with short legs came out, carrying a wet sponge. Who's that? Asked Alexander. He's not one of the regular cooks. How can you tell when he's all bundled up? Said Nicky. Alexander shrugged. The chef wiped the menu clean. Then he wrote. Alexander's jaw dropped. Sure enough, There were several buckets of ice cream and dozens of toppings, beneath a sign that said "Serve yourself." "Yes," yelled Rip. He gave Nicky a high 10. "Find us a table, Salamander. Nicky and I have some lunch to scoop." Alexander shuffled over to a table and flipped open his lunch box. Behind the note was a peanut butter, carrot, and celery sandwich. It looked like a bunny. Alexander chomped a carrot. Then he shivered, but not because of the cold. The tall chef was glaring at him. Alexander swallowed. The chef ducked behind a counter as a lunch lady stepped into view. She read the new menu, shrugged, and refilled the chocolate sprinkles. Boom! The table shook as Rip slammed down his mountain of ice cream. Rip held his spoon high. "Never again," he said, "will lunch be this good." Then he dug in. Nicky sat down with a sundae of her own. "Something's not right," said Alexander. "I mean, the super cold school? That oniony smell? A new chef? And now ice cream for lunch?" "You're just mad you brought your lunch on the one day they serve ice cream," said Nicky. "Grom! Grom!" She scarfed down her sundae, splashing strawberry sauce everywhere. "Nice table manners, you monster," said Rip. Rip wasn't joking. Nicky actually called a jampire. Alexander and Rip had been surprised to learn that Nicky was a monster. But really, Nicky was more or less a regular girl. She gave Alexander a big, drippy grin. "How are your veggies?" she asked. "Fine," said Alexander. He snapped his celery in half. Crunch. Chapter 6, A Real Pickle. The next day, Stermont Elementary was even colder. "Good morning, Salamander," said Nicky. She and Rip were bundled up near the classroom door. "Hey," said Alexander. The onion smell had faded, but he snapped his goggles into place. "Just in case." "Ugh," said Rip, rubbing his tummy. "I overdid it yesterday with the ice cream. Next time I'll stop at 11 scoops." "Hopefully today's lunch will be back to normal," said Alexander. Mr. Plunkett bounced into the room. "Take your seats," he said. "Today's lesson, forks. If you're going to be good waiters tomorrow, you need to know your silverware." "Sheesh," Alexander whispered to Nicky. "I'm not looking forward to serving the grown-ups at the chili supper." Mr. Plunkett tacked a chart to the wall. "Now, which fork is best for spearing a pickle?" he asked. Alexander stared up at the chart. "I feel like a pickle, sitting in this crispy, cold, metal room," he thought. "That's it! The whole school has been turned into one big refrigerator." Chapter 7, Ready. Aim, splat! Alexander spent the rest of the morning trying to convince Rip and Nicky that monsters were turning their school into a refrigerator. "And look!" Alexander said as they stepped into the cafeteria. "The monsters even changed the menu again." "Pie?" Alexander said, raising an eyebrow. "Why would a school serve just pie?" Rip and Nicky looked at each other, and then over at the pie case. "Listen, Salamander," Rip began. "Surely the school is looking out for us." "Yeah," said Nicky, heading toward a tall wedge of raspberry pie. Alexander sighed. Once again, he carried his lunch box to an empty table to wait for his friends. He looked around. Everyone was chowing down on pie. He flipped open his lunch box. Beneath his dad's note was a veggie pita. Alexander took a bite as Rip and Nicky plopped down their trays. "Watch me use my table manners," said Rip. He nibbled a bite of his blueberry pie. "Manners?" "Ha," said Nicky. She attacked her pie. Her plate looked like a crime scene. Here, Salamander, said Rip. Try a bite. He scooted his pie toward Alexander. Alexander slammed his fist down. No, he barked. There's something wrong here. School lunches should be healthy. Pie and ice cream for lunch is just weird. He stood up and began shouting to the entire cafeteria, I don't know why, but we shouldn't trust this pie. Am I right? Pie-stained faces stared back at Alexander. Rip began waving his arms. Sorry, Rip. You can't stop me, Alexander said. He held Rip's pie above his head. Even if no one believes me, I can't let you eat this pie. It's going in the garbage. He spun around and threw the pie right into Ms. Vanderpants's face. Silence fell over the lunchroom as clumps of blueberry rolled down the principal's coat. Everyone could hear what Ms. Vanderpants said next, even though she spoke in a whisper. Alexander Bop, see me after school. Ms. Vanderpants stormed out, her face purple with anger or maybe smushed blueberry. Chapter 8, Lights Out. Rip shook Alexander's hand all the way to gym class. Salamander, you're my hero, he said. A pie? Right in Vanderpants's face? It was an accident, said Alexander, pulling his hand free. And I'm in huge trouble. What will she do to you? Asked Nikki. Alexander shook his head. Whatever it is, it won't be good. The friends filed into their school gym, which had been the old hospital's laundry room. I can't wait for our new school to be finished, said Rip. Just imagine having gym in an actual gym, instead of in this dump. Mr. Horsley stood near a clothes dryer, trying to untangle the cord on his whistle. Well, students, Mr. Horsley said. Since the school's so cold, we won't change into our gym clothes today. Can we play dodgeball? Asked Rip. No way, said Mr. Horsley. It's dangerous to throw balls at other students. Let's play something safe, like tag. Nikki snapped an icicle off a leaky pipe. I think he means freeze tag, she mumbled. Mr. Horsley checked his clipboard. So I guess, when I blow my whistle, just play tag. The students began chasing one another. However, no one was it. So they more or less ran in circles until clunk. The lights went off. The room went dark. Students crashed into one another. Nikki, said Alexander. What's happening? You can see in the dark, right, Nikki? Added Rip. Yes, she shouted. Come toward my voice. Whoosh! Something flew past Alexander's head. What was that? He cried. It looked like some sort of volleyball, said Nikki. Watch out! Here come more. Alexander heard more balls whiz by. Dodgeball in the dark. Rip yelled. This is awesome. He ran off. Splat! One of the balls hit a nearby kid. Gross, she said. This ball's smushy. Salamander, jump left, said Nikki. Now, right. Alexander followed her directions. Now, catch, called Nikki. Huh? Alexander opened his arms and flomp. Caught one of the balls. It was heavier than a volleyball. And slimy. And moving. Alexander dropped it and felt it roll across his shoe. They're alive, he shouted. Just get down, said Nikki. I'll go find the light switch. Alexander dropped to the floor. He heard dozens of balls whooshing overhead. Bonk! BLAP. Splat. Then, silence. Click. The lights went on. There was no sign of the whizzing balls. Eep. Mr. Horsley peeked out of the dryer. All of the students had dropped to the floor, except one. Rip wobbled in the middle of the room, covered in greenish goo. Then he fell down. Chapter 9, The New Nurse. Alexander and Nikki dragged their bruised friend to the nurse's office. The room was big. A fake skeleton hung near his door. At least Alexander hoped it was fake. There's one good thing about having school in an old hospital. We have an amazing nurse's office, said Nikki. Alexander saw pictures of brains on the wall. Looks like this used to be the brain surgery room, he said. Ding! Nikki rang the bell. Said Rip, lifting his head. Why didn't Horsley just come with us? He's the nurse, right? Hey, good point, said Alexander. He can't be everywhere at once, said Nikki. She looked at Rip's bruises. So what were those balls that attacked us? Alexander dug out the notebook. There's only one ball-shaped monster in here. Blinker. Your typical, everyday giant floating eyeball. Habitat, jewelry stores, car wash, clean bathrooms. Any place with lots shiny, sparkly surfaces. Look! Blinkers always win staring contests. Diet, they feed on light and color. Behavior, blinkers love bad TV. Especially game shows. Warning! Never look them in the eye. A blinker's gaze hypnotizes you. This makes it so you cannot peel your eyes away from boring movies you've already seen 40 times. Alexander read the entry aloud. Then he turned to Nikki. Could the balls that hit Rip have been blinkers? No, said Nikki. The balls were green and... Oh, goodness, said a sweet-sounding voice. Is someone ill? A large woman stepped into the room. A hairnet covered her bushy hairdo, and a surgical mask covered her face. Her name tag said Nurse Brock. Our friend Rip is, said Alexander. He got pounded by, dodgeballs. Oh, dear, said Nurse Brock. She leaned down and looked at Rip. Tell me where it hurts. Are you tender here? She poked him once in the ribs. Ow. Yes, said Rip. Said Nurse Brock. She looked down to Alexander and Nikki. You children run along. I'll take care of this little pork chop. When Nurse Brock's back was turned, Nikki whispered to Alexander and Rip, let's meet at SSMP headquarters after school. I saw something else in the gym that we should talk about. Okay, Alexander said. But I may be a little late. I've already got an, appointment with the principal. Have fun, Rip said between moans. See you at SSMP headquarters. Chapter 10, A Chilling Secret. Alexander squirmed in his seat the rest of the afternoon. Then he rode the elevator to the coldest floor of the old hospital, the sub-basement. He came to a door that said heating and cooling room with a sign tacked underneath, principal's office. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door. It swung open. Hello? Alexander said. He could see his breath. Ms. Vanderpants? She wasn't there. But there was a note. Mr. Bopp, please wait. I will return. Principal Vanderpants. Alexander looked around. Low-hanging pipes crisscrossed overhead, branching out from a huge machine in the corner. The machine was shaking, humming, and covered in frost. The air conditioner, thought Alexander. Then he blinked. Something purple and shiny like a sheet of wrapping paper was rattling around inside the machine. Alexander squatted down and pulled open a grate. The purple shiny thing blew out and drifted down into his hands. Thought Alexander. This looks like. He gave it a sniff, a giant onion peel. His eyes watered. This is what was making everyone cry. I was right. Something else caught his eye, a small dial on the machine. The air conditioner wasn't broken after all. Thought Alexander. Someone had set the dial to double Antarctica. He turned the dial to cozy. The enormous machine shuddered and went silent. Hello, Alexander. Alexander jumped and hit his head on a pipe. Hello. Miss Vanderpants, he said, jamming the onion peel into his pocket. She stared at Alexander. Her clothes were stained with blueberry splotches. Alexander cleared his throat. I'm, sorry about hitting you with that pie. Actually, said Miss Vanderpants. I should apologize to you for getting in your way. Alexander wondered if he had bonked his head too hard. That's why I called you here, she continued. I'm pleased to know you chose a healthy lunch over pie. And so I've made you head student chef at the chili supper tomorrow. Alexander's eyes widened. But I can't cook. Mr. Horsley will help, said Miss Vanderpants. She began flipping through papers. You may leave. Alexander headed out the door, hoping Miss Vanderpants couldn't hear the crinkly onion peel in his pocket. Chapter 11, Big, Orange, and Hungry. Alexander ran through the woods behind his house. He couldn't wait to tell his friends about what Miss Vanderpants had said and about the onion peel. The SSMP headquarters, an old caboose, was hidden in the woods. Nicky was all ready. There, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Where's Rip? Asked Alexander. Not here yet, said Nicky. I hope he's okay. Nurse Brock probably sent him home, said Alexander. So, how was your meeting with Principal Vanderpants? Asked Nicky. You'll never believe this, said Alexander. I'm not in trouble. In fact, she made me head student chef for tomorrow's chili supper. Whoa! Nicky said. Speaking of chef. That's what I needed to tell you. I saw who turned out the lights in gym class. It was our new chef, the one who changed the menu. Alexander frowned. I found something weird, too. He showed Nicky the big onion peel. This was in the air conditioner. And the dial was set to double Antarctica. Nicky drew a line in the dirt. Okay, let's make a list of what we know. Weird chef. Dessert for lunch. Cold school. Giant onion. Flying green ball monsters. Alexander looked at Nicky's list. She had drawn 3 circles in a row. He gasped when he saw the circles. Nicky! That's it! Pass me your stick. Alexander drew 2 arcs around the circles. Those balls were peas. Giant peas, yelled Alexander. And the onion with a skin this size must be huge. Nicky narrowed her eyes. You think we're up against vegetable monsters? Yes, said Alexander. Veggie monsters must have lowered the temperature to turn Sturmont Elementary into one big vegetable drawer. Like in a refrigerator. He smacked his forehead. Oh! Remember that round-looking repair guy? He must be an onion. That was his peel in the air conditioner. Nicky nodded. That explains everything except for the crazy lunches. Why is ice cream suddenly on the menu? To fatten you up, growled a voice. Alexander and Nikki jumped back. The new chef stepped into the light. He yanked off his hat. Green leaves sprung up. You're a carrot? Asked Alexander. Yes, said the carrot. And I'm hungry. We plan to eat everyone at tomorrow's feast. But your tender friend said you'd try to stop us, so I felt like having a little pre-dinner snack. The monster tromped forward, flashing its pointy teeth. Alexander threw his stick at the carrot. The carrot laughed. You can't hurt me with a stick. We don't feel pain, we're vegetables. Suddenly, the carrot froze in place. It began to tremble. Shish shish. A white rabbit peeped out from some nearby weeds. The rabbit sniffed the air, then hopped toward the carrot. No! The carrot sprinted away. Alexander and Nikki ran straight to Alexander's house. Phew, said Alexander, between breaths. We're lucky that rabbit showed up. Yeah, said Nikki. But it sounds like the veggies have rip. What's our plan? I'll study the notebook for vegetable monsters, said Alexander. He peered outside. We'll make a battle plan tomorrow morning. Rip is counting on us. Hey, kiddos, said Alexander's dad, popping into the kitchen. Tomorrow's the big night. Ready to feed a bunch of hungry mouths? Alexander gulped. Chapter 12, Mr. Manners. Mr. Plunkett waited for his students to stop groaning. Then he plowed ahead with a third day of teaching table manners. Take out your napkins and start folding, he said. The chilly supper is tonight. Alexander and Nikki sat in the back of the room, staring at Rip's empty seat. Do you think the veggies ate him? Whispered Nikki. No, said Alexander. Not yet, the carrot said they'd feast on us tonight. Let's go see Nurse Brock. She was the last dash. Ahem. Mr. Plunkett was standing right in front of Alexander. What could possibly be more important than napkin folding? He asked. Alexander said. Well, Nurse Brock, who? Said Mr. Plunkett. Nurse Brock. Yesterday dash. There's no Nurse Brock here, said Mr. Plunkett. Horsley is the school nurse and dash. Listen up. Miss Vanderpants's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. Head student Chef Bop, report to the lobby. It's time to prepare the chilly supper. That's me, said Alexander. Mr. Plunkett's frown turned upside down. Head chef, he asked. Use your table manners. Make us proud. Alexander swung his backpack onto his shoulders. Hey, Nikki, he whispered. Keep an eye out for Rip. She nodded, frowning. You know, I kind of miss that guy. Chapter 13, New School. On their way to the new school, Alexander and Principal Vanderpants passed a road sign that had been mashed against the sidewalk. Unbelievable, said Ms. Vanderpants. Who would do such a thing? Veggie monsters, thought Alexander. The flattened sign reminded him of Rip's flattened skateboard. Must have been a big monster. They soon arrived at the construction site. Alexander thought the new school, or what was completed of it, looked like a cross between a castle and a spaceship. What is that big glass room on top of the building? Alexander asked. That's our greenhouse, said Ms. Vanderpants. It's the only part that's finished. We'll grow food for school lunches in the garden up there, and we've got a plant lab for important tests. Wow, said Alexander. Mr. Horsley stuck his long neck out of a nearby tent. Okay, Alexander, he said. Let's get started. The two of them began setting up a kitchen in the tent. Mr. Horsley, said Alexander. We don't have much time. Rip's been taken by these giant veg dash. Whoa, said Mr. Horsley as he handed Alexander a stack of napkins. You're right. We don't have much time. These napkins won't fold themselves. Mr. Horsley seemed to be the only grown-up in Sturmont who could see monsters. But he refused to talk about them. Now, then, said Mr. Horsley. We have a chopping table and a big pot for the chili. We need dash. He dropped his ladle. What? Asked Alexander. The food, said Mr. Horsley. He threw open a cabinet, revealing hundreds of cupcakes. I don't understand. The dinner food is missing. All we have is dessert. Alexander peeked out of the tent. The parents are starting to arrive, he said. And Principal Vanderpants is walking toward the stage. No! Mr. Horsley cried. Alexander dashed outside. His classmates were rushing around, setting tables. Suddenly, the parents started clapping. Miss Vanderpants had taken the stage. Welcome, parents, she said. The money you have paid for this chilly supper will let us move out of the old hospital building and into our new school. The new Sturmont Elementary will be 100% green, said Ms. Vanderpants. We'll grow our food in the greenhouse and use the wind from this windmill for our electricity. The tall curtain behind her fell, revealing a huge spinning windmill. Alexander saw his dad snap a photo. Then he saw something else. Alexander tapped Nikki's arm. Then he pointed at the windmill. Yeah, said Nikki. Those blades are huge. No, Nikki, he said. Look who's behind the windmill. It was Nurse Brock, rolling an enormous pumpkin. Chapter 14, Pumpkin Cell. Nurse Brock is a vegetable monster, said Alexander. And I bet she's our ripnapper, said Nikki. Let's follow her. They both ducked into the kitchen tent. Mr. Horsley was going crazy. Chef Bop, he cried. We're doomed. We can't have a chili supper without chili. I'm sorry, Mr. Horsley, said Alexander. But we've got bigger fish to fry. I mean, vegetables to chop. Alexander grabbed a carrot peeler and handed Nikki a potato masher. They snuck out the back. Where'd Nurse Brock go? Asked Alexander. Nikki squatted down near some odd marks in the dirt. Look! Pumpkin tracks. The tracks led to a metal staircase, which led up to the greenhouse. Come on, said Alexander. We've got to find Rip. They tiptoed up the stairs. It was warm inside and misty, like a jungle. They hid behind a bush and looked around. Nikki nudged Alexander. I see the pumpkin. They crept through the plants to the middle of the greenhouse. The pumpkin had been carved like a jack-o'-lantern. But instead of a face, it had a window with bars on its front. A spiky-haired, square-headed kid sat inside. Rip, shouted Alexander, running over. Hang in there. We're going to bust you out. Rip shook his head. Ugh. Really, guys? Don't you know a trap when you see one? Nikki had been yanking on the bars, but stopped. What? Asked Alexander. What do you OOF? A slimy green cannonball slammed into his back. Actually, it wasn't a cannonball. It was a pea. Then Nurse Brock stepped into the light, holding a large pea pod. She tore off her hairnet. She was a walking, talking stalk of broccoli. She snapped her fingers. And a dozen more vegetables sprung out of the garden. Since the beginning of time, said the broccoli, we've been chopped, diced, pickled, or, worst of all, fed to your hamsters. The other vegetables growled. But tonight, we eat. We'll chomp adults for forcing kids to eat us in the name of health. We'll munch kids for using us as noses on their snowmen. And now, we'll eat you three for getting in our way. A giant potato fixed its 20 eyes on Alexander. But first, I'm gonna mash you so you're soft and tender. Hey, wait, said Alexander. It was you who mashed that crossing sign. And my skateboard, yelled Rip. He called over to Alexander and Nikki, I should have listened to you before, Salamander. These are some tough veggies, nothing scares 'em. That's right, grumbled the carrot. Alexander looked at the carrot and then at Nikki. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? He asked. For sure, yelled Nikki. Alexander dropped his peeler through the bars and whispered to Rip, peel your way out. Nikki and I will keep 'em busy. Head to the park where your little friend is holed up and bring her here. Hurry! Rip started peeling as fast as he could. Alexander and Nikki ran off, followed by an angry mob of mixed vegetables. Chapter 15, Tossed Salad. As Alexander and Nikki sprinted through the greenhouse, Rip bolted from the construction site. Let's hide in there! Alexander shouted to Nikki. They squeezed into a patch of enormous sunflowers, each trying to catch their breath. Boo! The broccoli peeked in. Alexander and Nikki tumbled out, scratching up their arms. How are these monsters not getting tired? Alexander said between breaths. Rip had better hurry back. The greenhouse was like a maze. They soon found themselves near a balcony overlooking the chilly supper. We're cornered, said Nikki, holding up her potato masher. Growling vegetables stalked in from all sides. Finally, after fattening you kids up on ice cream and pie, we can eat, said the broccoli as it closed in on Alexander. No more Sundays for me, yelled Nikki. She was about to be squished by squash. A husk of corn pressed against Alexander, ear to ear. Back off, weenies! Rip jumped between Alexander and the corn. He held up something small and red. A regular radish, growled the corn. Is that supposed to scare us? Nope, said Rip. But I'm guessing she will. Rip dropped his radish to the floor. The veggie monsters looked down to see a long trail of radishes. A moment later, Sturmont Stella hopped into view. She picked up a radish and started nibbling. The vegetable monsters all ran screaming from Stella. Gopher! Rip and Nikki were shoved into a muddy pit, while Alexander got bumped outside, onto the balcony. Alexander looked over the rail. He could see the party lights below, and adults staring into empty bowls. And whoosh! He felt a breeze from the huge windmill, spinning nearby. Salamander, yelled Rip. Alexander looked into the greenhouse. Stella was taking a nap. The veggies were closing in on Rip and Nikki, who were hip-deep in mud. Hey, veggies! Alexander shouted from the balcony. You've already trapped those two. Bet you can't catch me. A cucumber turned toward Alexander. He's right, guys. Let's get him. The vegetables rushed the balcony and, as one bunch, took a flying leap at Alexander. He took a step back and whoop! Slipped on a giant pea. Oomph! Alexander fell onto the balcony floor. Then he watched as the vegetables sailed over him. Off the balcony. Into the blades of the giant windmill. Chapter 16, Chop Chop. There you are, Al, said Alexander's dad. I've been looking for you all night. Alexander watched his dad swallow a spoonful of chili. Best. Veggie. Chili. Ever. What's in here, anyway? Alexander smiled. A chef never shares his secrets. He walked to the kitchen tent. Mr. Horsley, Alexander said. The veggie monsters dash. Tut tut, said Mr. Horsley. I don't want to hear the M-word. He leaned in. I thought the supper was going to be ruined, but then diced vegetables rained from the sky. I caught enough to feed everyone. Those veggies dash. Nope. Mr. Horsley said. I don't want to know. Okay, Alexander said. Have you seen Rip and Nicky? Oh, sure, said Mr. Horsley. I made them wash up, they were so muddy. Alexander found his friends at the sink. The SSMP weeded out another monstrous plot, said Nicky. Yeah, said Rip. The best part was watching you stand up to that corn. Aw, shucks, said Alexander as he pulled out the notebook to make a new entry. I couldn't have done it without you guys. Meat-eating vegetables. A crispy, leafy, crunchy bunch of monsters. Habitat, weird new greenhouse. Diet tender, juicy grade schoolers. Yeah, corn and tomatoes aren't technically vegetables, but we humped them in here anyway. Behavior, veggie monsters pretend to be school workers so they can chill, tenderize into, mash you shape, and fatten you up before, chomp. Warning! Got a beef with the veggie monsters? Cook your way out. Take a dozen mixed veggie monsters. Asterisk chop into small bits. Heat in a pot for 20 minutes. Asterisk yum.